Okay, good afternoon. We will begin. So after a great start with the Jewish political tradition, we are now meeting to discuss the paradox of liberation, another important seminal book by Michael Walzer, with three wonderful speakers and commentators on his work. I won't assume that the audience as a whole recalls the gist of the book, and I will try and summarize the main arguments for the sake of the following discussion. So Michael Walzer's The Paradox of Liberation investigates a striking and recurrent pattern in the political histories of several post-colonial societies. Secular, nationalist liberation movements succeeded in freeing their countries from imperial rule, only to be challenged, sometimes displaced, by religiously inspired counter-movements that derived their authority from traditions the liberators had hoped to transcend. Walzer traces this paradox through three case studies: India, Israel, and Algeria, arguing that the trajectories of these states reveal a common tension between emancipatory ideologies rooted in universalist modernizing aspirations and the enduring power of religious identities that the liberation elites sought to marginalize. Walzer's central claim is that the leaders of anti-colonial struggles were not only nationalists but radical reformers. They were committed to reshaping their societies along secular, rational, egalitarian lines inspired by European Enlightenment and socialist thought. Figures such as Nehru, Ben-Gurion, and Boumediene viewed religious traditions as an impediment to national progress, an obstacle to be overcome rather than a cultural reservoir to be integrated. Their projects of liberation were therefore dual in nature. The struggle was directed simultaneously against the foreign colonizer and against internal patterns of belief and authority deemed pre-modern. This dual struggle produced a persistent vulnerability. While the liberation movement succeeded military and institutionally, they often failed culturally. Their modernizing vision, articulated in lead, urban, often westernized idioms, did not penetrate deeply into the rural, traditional, and religiously observant sectors of society. For many citizens, the liberators' secular nationalism appeared alien, disconnected from familiar moral vocabularies and communal identities. Walzer argues that the resulting cultural gap created an opening for religious revivalist movements that claimed to speak more authentically in the name of the people. The paradox emerges here. Liberation movement that sought to emancipate their nations from domination unintentionally laid the groundwork for resurgent religious collectivities that questioned the legitimacy of the secular state. In India, Hindu nationalism emerged as a challenge to Nehruvian secularism. In Israel, religious Zionism and ultra-Orthodox communities increasingly contested the authority of the socialist secular founding generation. In Algeria, Islamist movements positioned themselves as the true heirs of popular authenticity in opposition to the FLN's state-driven modernization. I wish we could say the rest is history, but in fact, the rest is in our present and in the future, right? Michael offers some ideas about how these societies, how we could have confronted these challenges earlier on, even if we would not be able to defeat these trends. And we can go into this as part of the discussion. So we have with us three commentators, speakers, and we'll start. I'll introduce them each in their time, and we'll start with Professor Yuli Tamir. Professor Tamir is the president of Chicago College. He was deputy speaker of the Knesset and a member. Well, we know this is actually a central part. Minister of Immigrant Absorption and the Minister of Education. She's the author of Liberal Nationalism, Princeton University Press, as well as numerous articles in the fields of moral and political philosophy, philosophy education, feminism, and human rights. And there's much more that could be said about Yuli. As she told me this morning, that she was here many, many, many years ago, many, many times in a very significant moments in her life. And so I'm very happy to have you with us again.
I'll be standing for two reasons. First, as Noam said, Michael said, if you speak politics, you should stand. And also, somebody once told me that women should stand especially when they speak about politics, so they will be seen and heard. So I don't know, out of habit. I could summarize my comments by saying, you're right. Everything you said in the book is right, but I'll go a little bit further. So I've learned a lot from Michael's work. It is loaded with important lessons to internalize and follow. I was provoked by his lectures and writing, but reading The Paradox of Liberation paralyzed me. Like a fortune teller, Michael drew a dystopic future that cannot be avoided. I immediately realized he was right. I could feel the bad winds blowing behind my back. I read the book when it came out in 2015 and found it powerful and convincing. But like Michael, I think, I was hoping that somehow the powers of modernity will prevail. They didn't. 10 years later, it is quite clear that the process Michael anticipated is happening. The anti-revolutionary, anti-liberal forces have the upper hand. The interesting thing is that the collapse of liberalism is not happening only in liberated states like India, Algeria, and Israel. It is global. Modernity is not holding on even in its lands of origins. The rise of populism, the reemergence of authoritarian and religious forces in places where liberalism is not imported by enthusiastic secular liberator or imposed on local traditionalists to whom it was foreign, is a much greater challenge to the liberal vision. Many people cynically challenge me to surrender the idea of liberal nationalism. Sadly, I respond that the failure is encompassing all forms of liberalism. So here are two questions I would like to answer in this very short presentation. Why now, and why everywhere? In other words, I would like to change the subject from the paradox of liberation to the paradox of liberalism. In the struggle for a decent politics, Michael examines the state of modern political life through a deceptively simple question. What does it mean to be a liberal? Not a partisan identity, but as an adjective, guiding our political commitments. Rather than treating liberalism as a rigid ideology or a label attached to a particular party, he argues that the term liberal should describe a way of doing politics. Moderate, tolerant, pluralistic, open to compromise, committed to mutual respect among people who inevitably disagree. The liberal adjective tempers enthusiasm with empathy, ambitions with cautious. The central task for liberals is not to achieve a perfect solution, a political order, but to struggle for decent politics. Politics grounded in humility, restraint, and respect for the complexity of social life. This description sheds light on the depths of the crisis of liberalism. Liberal virtues, being moderate, tolerant, pluralistic, open to compromise, committed to mutual respect among people who inevitably disagree, are often misrepresented today as a sign of moral weakness or shallowness. Liberalism rivals dismiss them, offering in return purism, extremism, disrespect, and intolerance. They would certainly fail Politics 101 in any respected university, but they win the popular vote. No one represents them better than Donald Trump. America used to think about itself as having a long, unshakable tradition of liberal thinking. So did Britain, who assumed to have a pedigree of rights. This long tradition is of no avail. Liberal leaders are losing to populist leaders like Trump, and probably soon we'll see Farage emerging in Britain as a major force, if not as the prime minister. In a meeting with his supporters in New Jersey, Trump said, "Smart people don't like me." Another expression of meticulously crafted to show traits that his supporters value: spontaneity, outspokenness, and an outsider status. Strategic authenticity erodes the principle of democratic accountability and thinking. In a political climate dominated by carefully crafted messages, Trump's frankness stands out. His willingness to bridge the boundaries of political correctness is mistaken by some as a refreshing dose of honesty. Populist leaders today produced an outburst of chaotic, honest expression that Harry Frankfurt accurately described as bullshit. Bullshit, Frankfurt argued, is not simply another word for lying, exaggeration, or nonsense. Instead, it is a distinct category of speech defined by the speaker's indifference to truth. The liar still acknowledges the importance of truth because lying requires knowing what is true and trying deliberately to conceal or distort it. The bullshitter, by contrast, do not care whether what they say is true or false. Their primary aim is to create a certain impression, influence the audience, achieve a desired effect, with truth playing no role in this intention. Frankfurt contends the right of bullshit to social and cultural conditions prevalent in modern life. People often feel the need to express opinion, display expertise, or comments on matters they do not fully understand. Public life, political discourse, and advertising encourage speech driven by persuasion rather than by accuracy. Under these pressures, bullshit becomes increasingly common because it allows the speaker to bypass the responsibility of knowing what they're talking about. What Frankfurt did not predict is that bullshit will be celebrated as a sign of authenticity. In 2023, the Merriam-Webster Dictionary announced that authentic was the annual word of the year, meaning it was a high-volume dictionary lookup and a concept that people clearly was thinking and writing about. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, authentic has a number of meanings, including not false or not an imitation, as synonyms of real and actual, but most importantly, speaking one's own mind out. Authenticity is particularly important in an age driven by AI images. How can we know if what we see is what is true? How do we decipher the messages that come in front of us? The line between real and fake has been increasingly blurred. As a result, we are all a bit confused. Authentic is interpreted as being direct. That's the clearest thing we can notice. We listen to people and we say, do they say what is on their mind or do they not? Are they honest or do they conceal something? Trump walking into the peace conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, being 3 hours late, saying, I really don't like the people in this room, is considered authentic and highly valued. Diplomacy, in the old way of courtesy and niceties and etiquette, is seen as deceptive. So what we see is a reemergence of a political discourse that reflectiveness, restraining your views, not saying everything that is on your mind is actually seen as suspicious, whereas those people who are honest are the ones who are gaining trust. In a wild response to the limitation placed by woke, brutal authenticity advises people just to spit out what they have to say. If you have Jews, put on a swastika. If you hate women, grab them by the pussy. Tell the immigrants to go home, tell Muslims they are primitive, be honest, just say it out loud. The fascination with brutal authenticity pushes aside the liberal virtues. Reflectiveness, rational deliberation, the search for compromise, and the willingness to find a middle ground. In fact, in these terms, there is nothing less authentic than the middle ground. Why now? Authenticity wasn't invented in the 21st century. Its present interpretation and popularity are grounded in the collapse of the alternatives. Rational deliberation, cross-cultural understanding, searching for anti-ID compromises. A collapse stemming from confusion and helplessness characteristic of an age of VUCA, an age of what is called now volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and agility. Given the complexity of social and political issues, the agility of the decisions we make, many search for an escape. Freedom, rationality, reflectiveness is much more demanding and much less attractive than it used to be. I'm not sure it was very attractive also way back, but certainly now it fell out of fashion. Unreflective, crass bullshit is liberalism's first enemy. Religious authoritarian dogmatism is the other. In The Escape from Freedom, Eric Fromm argues that modern individuals, after gaining political freedom, often feel anxious, isolated, eager to submit to new forms of authority. Freedom is a double-edged sword. It liberates people from the external constraint, but it also removes the structure that once gave them stability, security, and belonging. When people cannot manage the burdens of freedom, they tend to escape into systems that offer certainty, even at the cost of autonomy. Faced with insecurity and indecisiveness, people turn to psychological mechanisms, allowing them to avoid the responsibility of freedom, submitting themselves to powerful leaders or systems, merging with some transcendent power, be it God, the state, or a populist leader. And no wonder populist leaders are often confused with God or with the king. So what we have is two kinds of authenticity, very different from each other. The authentic, I think, definition we used to think about as being yourself, reflecting, forming an idea, defending it. And the other authenticity that is now emerging as a competitor of just saying, what do you think this very moment? And you might just say the opposite next moment, but that doesn't really matter. Or if we look at the way political leaders now converse, they do not emphasize why they think something, they just say what they think, or actually not even what they think, what they feel. When Trump spoke to the Israeli parliament, when he came here, he spoke for, I think, 1 hour and 50 minutes, and most of the conversation about what he likes and dislikes. He said, I like Lapid, he's a nice guy, why don't you speak with him? I don't like this guy, he said this. And it was quite clear that the essence of the whole speech was Trump, rather than the issue, the solutions, or the deliberations of how to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I want to argue that the present failure of liberalism is grounded in the weakness of the alternative it offers to brutal, authentic, non-deliberative thinking. It is asking a lot, maybe too much. So the good news, Michael, is that you're absolutely right. The bad news is that the liberating forces are not the reason for the failures of liberalism. liberalism fails everywhere. Because maybe, just maybe, and it's I think even more horrific thought than Judaism and liberalism doesn't go together, or nationalism and liberalism go together. The really horrific thought is that liberalism demands too much. As Freud once said when he was asked by Einstein, why war? He said, well, maybe living in peace is beyond our psychological means. Maybe deliberating and acting rationally is beyond our psychological means. So the paradox of liberalism is that its demanding nature. It fits a selected few who by definition cannot constitute a democratic majority. Shimon Peres once asked one of his assistants, why was he losing one election after the other? The assistant said, it's simple, Shimon, you're not getting enough votes. This is exactly the Leer problem right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yuli. And our next speaker is Professor Menachem Mautner. He's a professor emeritus at the Faculty of Law at Tel Aviv University. He served as the dean of the faculty. He's also the author of 11 books, 140 articles published in Israel and abroad, and the editor of 6 books. His scholarship deals with the problems of Israel's political culture, Israel's liberalism, and Israel's multiculturalism. Mautner is a regular contributor to Haaretz, and among other of his vices is the fact that he is my teacher. Thank you, Meni, for being here, and we look forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Shai. Well, as you know well, nobody's perfect. Michael Walzer provides several explanations for the reversal constituting the paradox of liberation on which Shai commented. I shall mention 2 of Walzer's explanations. The first explanation is that there is a synergy between nationalism and religion, so that advancement of national projects inevitably disseminates religious contents. There's an interesting point here. For many years, it was thought that in early modernity, nationalism rose at the expense of and in opposition to religion. But in recent decades, the prevalent view has become the opposite, namely that nationalism and religion have usually been deeply intertwined and have operated in mutual support with each other. Another explanation offered by Walzer is that the culture of liberation was too thin to become a durable and lasting culture. In what follows, I wish to offer an explanation for secular liberalism's inferiority vis-à-vis religion that is close to Walzer's thinness thesis. I shall argue that human beings have an existential urge for meaning, but whereas religion is the richest system of meaning created by humankind, liberalism is a thin system of meaning that cannot compete with religion's thickness. There are several contents or meanings to the term meaning. By using the term, I refer to what I call big meaning, namely a set of propositions that aim at providing responses to the fundamental questions of human existence. Questions such as, who created the world? What is the good life? What happens to human beings after they die? Why is it there is so much suffering in the world? Why is it that there is so much gross injustice in the world? Systems that provide responses to such questions are what John Rawls calls religious, philosophical, and moral comprehensive doctrines. Many philosophers and thinkers wrote about the need of humans to have a system that provides them with meaning in the aforementioned sense. I'll mention just a few. Kierkegaard, for example, writes that every human being, no matter how slightly gifted he is, however subordinate his position in life may be, has a natural need to formulate a life view, a conception of the meaning of life and of its purpose. Charles Taylor writes that systems of meaning provide the background, explicit or implicit, for our moral judgments, intuitions, or reactions. Doing without such meaning, claims Taylor, is utterly impossible for us. It is to fall into a life which is spiritually senseless. And Erich Fromm, mentioned earlier, writes that without a system that provides meaning and direction to life, an individual feels like a particle of dust and is filled with doubt that will eventually paralyze his ability to act, that is, to live. Religion is the most comprehensive system of meaning available to us. Terry Eagleton writes that religious fundamentalism is the neurotic anxiety that without a meaning of meanings, there is no meaning at all. In addition to providing responses to the fundamental human questions I listed above, religions create coherence in lives bifurcated between distinct spheres of activity, each governed by a unique logic. Religions also provide their followers with some overall causal sense when their fate is being affected by what looks like chance and luck, as well as by deeds of faraway people whom they don't even know, Donald Trump, and by global and natural processes over which they have no control. For example, the subprime financial crisis of 2008 and global warming. Religions are based on thick human anthropology. They portray both the bright side of humanity, the virtuous life, together with the dark side, such as the human predilection for evil, violence, cruelty, greed, manipulation, and corruption. Also, and perhaps even more importantly, most importantly even, religions offer their followers intellectual, emotional, practical, and ritualistic resources for dealing with losses, failures, and disappointments. Next to religion, though to a lesser extent, national culture is another system of big meaning. National cultures usually provide members of national groups with a narrative about the history of the group, its values, its future vision, etc. Jean Amery claims that in the strongest terms, that people embedded in religious and ideological systems of meaning did better in the extreme situation of Auschwitz than people who lacked such systems, including secular intellectuals. And Primo Levi agrees with Amery. I wish to argue now that when it comes to the provision of meaning, autonomy liberalism, the dominant current of liberalism, at least in the United States and in many other countries, such as Israel, suffers a major deficit compared to religion. What I have in mind here are the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the deficit also exists compared to liberalism. Deficit exists also compared to nationalism. Autonomy liberalism cannot offer a coherent system of meaning. It leaves the issue of the good life to individuals that are supposed, as the cliche goes, to be the authors of the story of their lives. Nor is autonomy liberalism capable of providing response to any of the other fundamental human questions I listed above. The result is, as Jeremy Waldron writes, that autonomy liberalism seems empty. And yet, as autonomy liberalism is legalized liberalism, the law of the liberal state, first and foremost its constitution and constitutional jurisprudence, is the locus of the contents of autonomy liberalism. These contents include such fundamental values as the sanctity of life, liberty, the equal moral worth and dignity of individuals, the plurality of the good, respect for individual agency, toleration, the rule of law, and freedom of expression. But these values are mainly political, so it is doubtful whether they bear in any meaningful way on the daily experiences of individuals. Also, some important virtues such as modesty, piety, fidelity in relationships, gratitude, integrity in speech and conduct, and the readiness to sacrifice one's personal welfare for the welfare of others, these virtues are missing from the list of autonomy liberalism's virtues. The claim I wish to make now is that art should be viewed as the secular equivalent of religion in the sphere of meaning, or put differently, art should be viewed as the secular substitute for religion. So also I want to argue that a state that wishes to rival religion in the terrain of meaning, a liberal state that wishes to rival religion in the terrain of meaning, should support the creation and dissemination of art. Important strains of thought on art in the 20th century severed the traditional tie between art and beauty and presented art instead as a rich sediment of meaning. The great philosopher of art, Arthur Danto, expressed this approach when he wrote that the meaning of a work of art is an intellectual product which is grasped through interpretation, and the beauty of the work, if indeed it is beautiful, is seen as entailed by that meaning. And Charles Taylor expressed this same idea when he wrote that the aura that surrounds art in our life comes from the sense that what it reveals has great moral and spiritual significance, that in art lies the key to a certain depth or fullness or seriousness or intensity of life, or to the creation of wholeness. However, prominent American liberal thinkers such as John Rawls, Ronald Dworkin, and Bruce Ackerman find it problematic for the state to be involved in the domain of art. What seems to be the basis of the similarity in the positions of these thinkers is their adherence to the neutralist brand of liberalism, with its concern for equal respect on the part of the state towards its citizens. Dworkin, for example, writes that for the state to encourage watching a painting of Titian hung on the wall rather than watching an American football on TV screen amounts to the state showing disrespect to some of its citizens, those who prefer football over art, over Titian. For reasons I don't have time to elaborate here, I disagree. I suggest that the liberal state should support the creation and dissemination of art. I claim that by doing that, the state will provide its citizens with intellectual resources, enabling them to devise, drawing on their own personal intellectual resources, responses to some of the questions usually addressed by systems of meaning such as religion. Needless to say, the outcomes of such personal endeavors cannot be compared to systems of meaning explicitly articulated and disseminated by religious establishments over generations. But this is the utmost the liberal state can do in its competition with religion in the domain of meaning. And finally, we have to bear in mind that autonomy liberalism is only one version of liberalism. A second is what is known as social liberalism, or even liberal socialism. Yes, liberal socialism. A liberalism I refer to as the liberalism of human flourishing. The founding father of this version is no other than John Stuart Mill, and it has been developed following Mill mainly by British thinkers. The ideal of the good life advocated by this liberal version is not personal autonomy, but the development of innate human capabilities, first and foremost our intellectual and moral capabilities. Social liberalism expects the state to adhere to the imperatives of social democracy. that is to say, to provide its citizens with extensive sustainment in the realms of healthcare, education, housing, job security, and guaranteed income, as well as to fund the creation and dissemination of art. And this, in turn, explains the marginality of this version of liberalism in a country such as the United States. Socialism and social democracy, of course, can never be central in the American way of thinking. So this explains its marginality of this version of liberalism in a country such as the United States, and in countries heavily influenced by the United States, such as Israel. Marginal, but not non-existent, however. In the preface to his 2023 book, The Struggle for a Decent Politics, Michael Walzer writes that he had been inspired by a book titled Liberal Socialism, authored by the Italian socialist and anti-fascist fighter Carlo Rosselli. Rosselli was highly influenced by Mill and his followers in Britain, the New Liberals, the British New Liberals. So Walzer writes that he was influenced by Rosselli's book. In a chapter titled Liberal Socialists, Walzer declares his commitment to liberal socialism and extensively discusses Rosselli's thought. So with Walzer, who, may I say, for many years now has been one of my greatest intellectual heroes, I would argue that social liberalism, or liberal socialism, is a worthy and noble alternative to autonomy liberalism, and it can fare much better than autonomy liberalism in the realm of meaning, namely in the competition of liberalism with religion over the minds and hearts of human beings. This is not something trivial for those concerned with the future of liberalism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meni. And our final speaker for this panel is Professor Khaled Furani, Professor of Anthropology at Tel Aviv University and a founding member of Insaniyat, Society of Palestinian Anthropologists. His most recent book, co-edited, titled Inside the Leviathan, Palestinian Experience at Israeli Universities, in Arabic, came out here at Leer, and he's currently running a research team at the Institute on Recognizing Tolerance in Palestinian Society. Khaled, it is always a pleasure to hear you.
Thank you, Shai. What a paradox. I thought coming in a panel to talk about paradoxes, I couldn't help but observe to be the first goy and a member of Meni's family, so to speak. So, speaking of paradoxes, proverbially speaking, right? Anyway, Shai, to get serious, I want to thank you first for inviting me. I want to say to you, Michael, Mazal Tov on your 90th birthday. Okay. Liberation, you write, Michael, is closer to revolutionary politics than to national aggrandizement. Is but one astute observation you offered a decade ago in the paradox of liberation. Reading these words today reminds me that Palestine is inspiring a true revolutionary politics, far beyond any aspiration for a state. A delusion of safety like the state can only stand for a feigned island of freedom amidst the oceans of horrors that is the world today. Since ancient times, the land of Palestine's divine and diverse revelations have told us as much. Liberation emanating from here can empower liberation elsewhere in the world. Your book should not only matter today because it asks us to ponder a paradox of liberation, whether apparition or real. It also offers a certain edification. Read contrapuntally, as I do here, it could even edify you. It calls upon you to no longer be frightened or reluctant to pursue liberation, yours included. As a Jew concerned with emancipation, the globally unfolding intifada is fully yours to join. Should you disabuse yourself from Zionism, you might discover that a greater exercise for understanding liberation awaits you. This greater understanding would open to a plurality of liberation's paradoxes, not only one paradox. Paramount among them arises when liberation takes the form of its ostensible negation, that is, submission. On the occasion of your 90th birthday, I wish to offer you, Michael, these words as possible new beginning, which you identify as necessary for any liberation. Please hear my words of intended hospitality with care and with patience, so as not to misconstrue my honesty for hostility. An ancient adage in Arabic, as ancient as the desert itself, says that the guest is the guest of God, الضيف ضيف Allah in Arabic. As you're our guest, Michael, I shall strive to welcome you in this spirit. Where this adage still lives, acts of hospitality carry the sacred in them. I pray there will be future occasions for us to give you gifts of hospitality in good health and spirit. When the land, all the land, and between and beyond the river and the sea is liberated for all its peoples. For as you crucially remind us, Michael, no nation can live for long under a foreign rule. My first welcome gift to you, fragile as it is truth. For if you know it, as one paradigmatic book of this ancient land teaches, it shall set you free. As liberation struggles are our focus in this hour, it is incumbent upon us to also summon fearlessness, as I wish to speak truthfully in all possible paths of honesty open to me, in what our Greek neighbors' ancestors called parrhesia, fearless speech. Your colleague in the métier of political theory, Hannah Arendt, once was fond of reminding us time and again of their imperial successors, the Romans' exhortation, fiat veritas e periat mundos. Let the truth be done, though the world may burn. We are witnessing the world burning today. Fires set off by a flood of truths and their suppression. And while you appear to be championing freedom in the paradox of liberation, I cannot help but sense that you have been peddling enslavement, including your own. As I read it in this diluvian moment of our world, propelled into sadness, my sadness, and pain and suffocation, the words of another poet, Mahmoud Darwish, come to mind. I hear Darwish voicing Chief Seattle from the Suquamish and Duwamish tribes, asking the Europeans who invaded and upended his world, to where, to what abyss are you taking your people and my people? I say another poet, for your chatty, attractive, disarming style, as described by Edward Said nearly 4 decades ago in critiquing an ahistorical Kant that was your meditation on the biblical narrative of Exodus, had me hear this book as a lullaby, composed to soothe us, to close our eyes, to put us to sleep, like an effect of oppression that you diagnose. This lullaby endangers passivity, the quietude, the deep lethargy of the dominated people. With extremely severe excisions and restrictions you conduct on reality, you echo Zionism's lulling mantras about Israel, its commitment to democracy, a success story, erecting a sovereign state against the colonial rule, Jewish self-determination finally arriving after 2,000 years of exile, 5 invading Arab armies as a crucial reason for enduring inequality among Arabs and Jews, and so on. You curiously also place the incompleteness of Palestinian liberation on its liberationists never having attended Israeli universities, as if they even could. For me, this is a new insight, but let me counter. Indeed, they have attended Israeli universities. They have attended those universities that are otherwise known as Israeli prisons, even completing proverbial doctorates there. In our brief time today, I cannot begin to correct what you refuse to see about us Palestinians. Plenty of others have spoken and written volumes doing so. I wish to instead say a bit more about your eloquent lullaby. one melody especially stood out for me as a reader of your book, the melody of Jewish supremacy. In this melody, Jews have higher morality, a higher life value, and even substitute themselves for God. You croon, within Israel proper, the worst forms of abuse have been avoided. And labor Zionists in power did better than the Algerians FLN in avoiding authoritarianism and brutality. Only FLN terrorizes, whereas the more lofty French repress, and the barely reproachable labor Zionist can occasionally fall from grace into mere militancy. Could you instead sing how Jews, like all people, are equally capable of devilish as well as divine acts? Might your lullaby carry a melody that prevents you from hearing how all lives matter equally? Are Jews somehow not human, qua humans? Or is there perhaps no working category of human, only Jew and Gentile, with Gentiles subdivided into with us and against us, the former worthy of life only when insofar as they avert descent into the latter, thereby making them worthy only of death. To me, the shrillest bar in your melody anoints Jews as the creators and originators whom others should imitate, as if offering a gift of secular theosis. Perhaps we could call it theogiosis. Here, Jews wrote the first liberation story as narrated in Exodus, the first instance of liberation from foreign rule. Foreign rule was Pharaoh's rule foreign to Egypt? The arrogance of this claim continues with the claim that Palestinian national liberation is the most authentic product of liberation movements such as labor Zionism. Oy vey, I said to myself. You even go so far as to invite us, Palestinians, to look on and do the same and imitate, cajoling us to imitate the imitators. Mein Gott, I said to myself, most generous reading of your invitation is that your deification of the Jews has enslaved you, obfuscating your ability to see Zionism's congenital moral travesty. But you may also truly mean for us to achieve our liberation by diminishing it through coveting someone else's bride, stealing another land, displacing its inhabitants, and founding a nation state based on superiority over and exclusion of the natives. Allahu Akbar, I said to myself. God is great, but your lullaby is not a complete retreat from reality. I have managed here and there to detect some very, very beautiful truths in it. I agree that liberation is an ongoing project and a very long process, not a single battle, for it does not happen all at once and for everybody in the world. It happens again and again. You're also heading in an approximately right and helpful direction when you state that what we should talk about now is Palestinian national liberation. I say approximately because Palestinian liberation exceeds the national. None of us are free, the slogan goes, until Palestine is free. And that we should be doing liberation, not only talking about it. Of course, Zionists have done, and especially undone, plenty. So permit me to thank you for letting us Palestinians, the group that comes next, have a place in line. Your main thesis that liberation struggles can give rise to a paradox is also very insightful. Yet rather than the paradox that you identify as arising from the liberationists in conflict with traditionalists, I see another one as far more fundamental. It arises any time a person striving for freedom builds a home with the master's tools, such as when Zionism perpetuates domination every time it claims to seek its negation, an aping cautioned by Hada'am well before the founding of Zionism's calamitous nation state. But for the abject glee we have been witnessing among Zionists who revel in humiliation and annihilation in the concentration camp that is Gaza, we have might recognized only aping. Perhaps in this instance, your elevation of Zionism is warranted, for it has outdone the ape. As a success in obtaining normalcy, Zionism is perhaps better narrated not as an epic of liberation, but as a longer, sadder story of accommodation to foreign rule. By that I mean making normal a deadly delusion, namely the ideal, or rather the idol, of political sovereignty. Zionism's founders may have left Europe, but they carried Europe in their baggage, including that melancholy continent's idols, and melodies, in addition to the melodies that angered the prophets about the people of Israel since antiquity. In negating exile, Zionists adopted oppression, including auto-oppression, and brought them on themselves an even more nefarious exile from theistic faith and its prophetic patrimony in pursuit of a new golden calf, the coldest of all cold monsters, political sovereignty in the form and the shape of the modern nation state. Leading with atheism, Ben-Gurion declared the following: "The British mandate is not our Bible. The Bible is our mandate." End of quote. Advancing a movement that has brought about the degradation of a vast living prophetic tradition. In this examination of liberation, like Ben-Gurion, here specifically, you curiously seem to overlook the value of prophetic inheritance while adapting an authoritative role in selling the cult of Zionism to the masses in the service of imperial power, reminiscent of the core Jew you so openly disparage. Rather than a return of the negated, as you refer to the religious counter-revolution, another paradox may stem from its founding principle of violence. What are we witnessing today is only a more extreme iteration of violence repeatedly activated and reactivated, beginning with the rhetorical erasure of a people who lived in the land, on the land Zionism claimed for itself alone. The principle may already be turning against its principle, just as magic has turned against the magicians in Pharaoh's court. The sedating conflation of that tradition with religious faith has led you to call politicized religion, an unfortunate modern misdescription, a pathology. In contrast, you acknowledge that national liberation can only possibly have a pathology. In claiming transformation requires the defeat of people's religious leaders, you leave out an entire slew of liberators, from Latin America's liberation theologians to Sojourner's Truth, from Martin Luther King to Malcolm X, from Gandhi to Jeanne d'Arc, and not to mention Islamic resistance. Would Moses have led his people out of Egypt without politicized religion? In your identification of pathologies, perhaps you should remember the historic fact that Nazism made a name for itself from nationalism and not from religion. I've been striving to present you with the gift of truth, in Arabic, haqiqa. But it has little merit without its constituent, haq, which is justice. Haq makes the word haqiqa in Arabic. And so out of hospitality attuned to the land's prophetic patrimony, specifically the voice of Noah, or the Noahic voice as I call it, I wish to offer you justice as well, braided with truth as its mate, into a rope to lead you out of the deluge, to jump ship, should you, a youth at 90, decide to start anew. In grasping this rope, you might just strive at a certain discernment, and speak not of that tradition, but of traditions in the plural. For even those who seek to defeat that tradition are inevitably working from within a specific tradition. Truth and justice intertwined might lead you to awaken from your lullabies ensnaring duality that pits liberationists against zealots and traditionalists. Should you grasp it for long enough and begin to climb, you would find yourself leaving Zionism's sinking ship and boarding the ark of Palestinian liberation. In this Diluvian moment, from which none is spared, Palestinian liberation can be your ark too. You observe that liberation is reiterative, so this ark may promise a greater liberation to come. Trusting God to lift the ark safely above a drowning flood, Noah offers one iteration for liberation. Noah offers only one iteration. Recall another iteration from Hajar. Hajar, the enslaved wife of Ibrahim and the mother of Ismail. Against the odds of abandonment and loneliness in a parched landscape, she sought to prevent Ismail's dissolution and death. Her faith in God was her freedom. Hajar's profound fidelity to God's oneness and God's uniqueness. Her radical trust that God would not forsake her and her child, liberated her. Neither deadly flood nor deadly thirst deprived Noah and Hajar from founding life anew. Whether in his or her iteration of freedom, both Noah and Hajar knew that through submitting to God, they put themselves on a path to freedom. Freedom to forge a new life amidst menacing despair and menacing death, perceptual, corporal, and political. In Mecca, Hajar's striving is reenacted year in and year out. There, people can discover, as you relay about Virginia Woolf, that their country is the whole world. Their country is the whole world. And perhaps unlike Virginia Woolf, it includes the world after it, after this one. So this truth is one that women and men stand to discover anytime they enact Hajar's paradigm of liberation, frantically scurrying between Mount Safa and Mount Marwa in search of water. In this Hajj ritual known as a Sa'i, Sa'i meaning striving, pursuing, scurrying, struggling, they remember this paradox of freedom with and through their souls and bodies. They live out Hajar's freedom from fear and refusal to surrender to despair, because her ultimate surrender was to God and only to God. To so submit to the Creator propels the self, the human self, to thinking and to action. Hajar's story of ancient persistence to find life-giving water coincides with the founding of a new life, as demanded of any liberation. You also note that oppressed people need a new beginning, requiring consciousness to be raised. Yet, because, as you say, national liberation is partial and particular, another gift is yours for the taking, Michael, the universal enterprise of emancipation known otherwise as Islam. You need not look on or imitate. You only need to look inside. Look inside within you, to the deep within you, and dedicate yourself to starting over. Once you do that, once you dedicate yourself to your awakening in God's ultimate, even unfathomable reality, all lullabies and their sedative, ensnaring dualities will sound superfluous and stupefying. Upon waking from the defunct and superfluous dualities, you will come to discover that you no longer need to deprive yourself of the genuine possibility of conceiving and experiencing religious tradition as potentially a proper space and time of freedom. As the annual ingathering that is the pilgrimage to Mecca reminds us, liberation can look, can sound, and feel like its ostensible opposite, namely submission. In cultivated submission to the divine, people still momentarily gather as a civilizational composite into one human ummatic fabric. You may be reluctant, Michael, you may be reluctant to board this ark of universal freedom that is Islam. For as you say, accommodating elites are fearful in the face of liberation, whose initial attempts are often brutally repressed. But just like with Hajar, the very thing you fear may be a wellspring enabling you to walk a path to freedom, letting self-aggrandizement, whether national or not, fall by the wayside. Thank you very much.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much, Khaled. We have a little time, not too much time, for questions and comments from the audience. Take your time to formulate some questions. I see Fanya. We need a mic.
Thank you so much to all three of you for a rather mind-boggling session. And I have a question for Manny and Yuli combined, I suppose, and another one for Khaled, if I may. The question is not only what happened to liberalism and why it has lost the battle for now, for the time being. But also, I think, if we go a little deeper than that, what happened to the self-awareness of liberalism some of whose thinkers acknowledged that the problem of meaning existed within liberalism all the way back to the 1970s, if not before. So somebody has to mention Isaiah Berlin, and if it's not Yuli, then it's me. But part of his project, of course, was to assign meaning to liberalism by latching it, both historically and philosophically, to what he called benign national consciousness. That is not malignant, rampant nationalism, but moderate nationhood. That's where he placed Zionism, at least all the way, with a few exceptions, all the way to the 1990s, his last years, when he started fearing that Zionism is being taken over by malignant, rampant nationalism. But Isaiah said, and I think that was part of Yuli's own original project too, that moderate national consciousness can and should go hand in hand with liberalism to create the sphere of belonging, group belonging, the sphere of meaning within a liberal society, minus the aggressiveness towards other nations, other groups, other societies. So that was one project. The other project was the rise of civic republicanism in its modern interpretation. I was part of that as a historian. The idea is that liberal democracy is not enough because it leaves the individual very individual and very passive. And so we also need a sense of the republic. We need a sense of active citizenry, which is not about ethnic identity, but it is about belonging to the same republican field with all the meaningfulness of belonging. And this civic liberalism also dovetailed, this civic republicanism also dovetailed with liberalism in its search of meaning. And of course, we have Michael's own and fellow thinkers' communitarianism, which was also a way to propel liberalism into a safer sphere of human meaning, human worth, human belonging. So when many talks today about social or even socialist liberalism, this is a part of the same pedigree, of the same dynasties of ideas which all offered certain additions or corrective or balancing acts to liberalism in its thin, autonomous, procedural sense. What happened to all those solutions that were based on forecasting the danger for liberalism in its individualistic emptiness? And if we understand what went wrong with those solutions, maybe we can come up with a future-looking plan combining liberalism, humanism, and meaning. This is my question to you.
Okay,
and
Fania, a question to Khaled, but let's try
very quickly. Khaled, I was listening very carefully. And when you threw the rope to Michael from this wonderful ship of meaning of Islamic liberation, of Palestinian liberation, and you use the word justice, which I find in discourse today is increasingly replacing the word peace. If you are pro-Israeli, you talk about peace. If you are pro-Palestinian, you talk about justice, not about peace. This rope felt to me like a noose that might be tied around my neck. I'm talking about my sheer survival and asking you whence or where from do you get those deep spring wells of peace and humanism that would accompany our submission to Islamist or to Palestinian justice? Who is going to protect us in the absence, at least in your talk, in the absence of any suggestion of a form of government, of civic interrelations, of group interrelations? Whom are you suggesting that we trust, we who have not yet embarked on the wonderful ship of Palestinian or Islamic liberation?
Thank you, Fania. Gail? But Gail, you need a mic, so can we make sure that Gail has... on its way.
Many thanks. My question is to Yuli, and maybe the first part of Mani's talk, because, maybe it's the difference because you're political philosophers, I'm a scholar of ideologies, but both liberalism and indeed the concept of liberation came not out of a vacuum. So it came out together both with the rise of course, the nation state and democracy. So looking at liberal democracy from within a national context, I think it did have what it takes both to have a community and to have a national culture and other things. And the question that we are facing today, the rise of populism or of national conservative populism, I want to take it fast forward to today because we're sitting in Jerusalem, and in Israel there was no real liberal camp. And I think over the last 3 years, the public resistance to the rise of national populism in Israel indeed gave birth to such a liberal camp. And I think that not like in the States, Israel, at least today, is at the verge of a very crucial elections in which we need to reproduce both national culture and a liberal narrative, which may hopefully ensure into the fact that we will not get down the line of being a halachic, religious, corrupt state. So it's on us in a way. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I think time is running out, so I guess we should come back to the panelists. Yuli.
I don't think I have an answer, actually. I think we know what did not work, and we're still searching for something that does work. You're right, Gail, that we have been hit so hard that it forced us to think who we are and why we are failing. I don't think that we have a good answer. And this is maybe because we put aside 3 questions. One is occupation. We didn't want to make this a defining feature of who we are. One is democracy that we didn't discuss today because we related to a specific text, and I think that focused on liberalism rather than on democracy. And the third is what I see is a big failure to be autonomous and self-governing in a confusing world like we have today. So at least a lot of what I was saying has to do with the fact that a lot of our presumptions about how people, liberal, free, democratic, self-governing, whatever, should behave, a lot of these assumptions are not appealing to people because not because they are wrong, because they rightly understand their inability to be rational agents and make rational decisions because of the complexity and volatility of the situation. So that is why the problem is real and the solutions are not simple. And the only thing we can do, like I ended my talk, for the next election is get out and get the voters vote. Mm-hmm. And after that, we'll have a theory. But that's the second stage.
Okay, I want to point out 2 sources of the current malaise. First, neoliberalism. We still live in the terrible effects of neoliberalism that rose in the United States, in many countries, other countries in the world, including Israel in the 1980s. I think, well, I don't want to use too big terms, but for me at least, it was a civilizational disaster. It demolished in many parts of the world the former social democratic state. Definitely in the States, you can say that FDR left for the United States a sort of social democratic country. In Israel, it was very instrumental in crushing Israel's imperfect social democracy. So neoliberalism is still highly influential in whatever happens in our lives in the United States, in Israel, in many other parts of the world. And the second point is the weaknesses of autonomy liberalism. On the one hand, as I said, it's a very noble ideal. On the other hand, it's vacuous. If you expect human beings to be able to be the authors of their life stories, it's too much, as mentioned earlier by Yuli and by myself and by many others. It's too much to ask of human beings, and you cannot expect people to have meaningful autonomy if the state does not provide them with education, health, housing, income security, etc.
Fania, thank you for your question. And in the interest of time, I'll have to respond in three telegraphic and fragmentary points, but happy to continue the discussion further about your wonderful question. The first point is really, remember what I just read to the audience here and to Michael specifically, that precisely from the site of fear, our fears, could our march to freedom begin. So one has to question one's fears, where it comes from. I'm sorry that the rope seems or feels or appears to you like a noose, but I would respond in my second point, get out immediately, and perhaps you latch onto the wrong rope. Because my third and final point, I'd like to say that as wonderful traditions, philosophical, religious, literary have taught us, when you ask the question, who will take care of us, right? I heard you ask that. I'll say, let's take care of justice, and maybe it will take care of us, but we can struggle for that together.
Thank you. Before we conclude, I just wanted to point out and sort of to bring this session back to the former one, that in some ways they work best in opposite order. That is, that the problem was discussed here, the problem of liberalism, the fate of liberalism. And I think that towards the end of the paradox of liberation, Michael discusses where solutions can come from. And part of the answer that Michael puts on the table is from the Jewish political tradition, understood, interpreted, pushed to new possibilities. And this is also how I heard Khaled's presentation, not about the Jewish political tradition, but continuing a conversation about political theology and about the danger of sovereignty and what happens when the state becomes deity, is deified. And so I think this is also part of an ongoing, opening of a conversation between different political traditions. Thank you, Meni. Thank you, Yuli. Thank you, Khaled. We will now have a short break, 15 minutes, and we will resume here 10 after the hour. Thank you so much.